I never thought I'd be the kind of man who'd end up living alone by a lake. After 22 years in emergency infrastructure response working wildfires, floods, even landslides across the western states, I thought I'd seen all the chaos I could handle. But nothing prepared me for the slow creeping kind of destruction that came dressed in khakis and HOA name tags. My name is Tom Keller. I'm 58, a widower, and the proud owner of 8 acres just beyond the edge of Ridgepoint Meadows, one of those polished suburban neighborhoods built with matching mailboxes and rules about the length of your grass. I bought my land long before the development rolled in. Back then, it was just me, my wife, and a quiet lake fed by a natural spring and a web of underground channels I learned to love like an old friend. After Julie passed ovarian cancer, swift and cruel, I couldn't handle the noise of the city anymore. So I retired early, sold our townhouse in Fort Collins, and moved out here full-time. The lake became my refuge. Mornings were coffee and birdsong. Evenings, I'd sit on the dock and watch the water ripple in the moonlight. It wasn't paradise, but it was mine. It felt like breathing again. At first, the encroaching development didn't bother me. Ridgepoint Meadows, built on the far side of the hill, and the HOA had their hands full managing speed bumps and spring block parties. We waved occasionally. Their little newsletters ended up in my mailbox, even though I wasn't a resident. I shrugged it off. Then came the notices. First, it was a letter. Harmless enough. The HOA was exploring community enhancement opportunities involving shared waterfront features. A few weeks later, a survey crew arrived at the edge of my tree line, clipboards, vests, and an attitude like they already owned the place. I walked down and introduced myself. You boys know this is private land. The foreman, a wiry guy with gelled hair and a permanent Bluetooth earpiece, grinned like he was humoring a child. According to the HOA's latest plat, sir, the lake is within Ridgepoint Meadows' shared utility easement. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud. Not a chance, I said, pulling out my worn property folder. I had deeds going back to 1968, topographic surveys, and a notarized water rights certification from the county's environmental office. This lake is mine. The HOA has no jurisdiction past that oak line. He nodded, made a show of flipping pages on his tablet, then gave me a polite shrug. We'll forward this to the board. Weeks passed. I thought that was the end of it. I went back to restaining my dock, checking on the muskrat nests, and fixing up the old canoe Julie and I had bought on our 10th anniversary. Then came the barges. I heard the rumble at dawn, a flatbed truck reversing down the HOA's gravel access road, hauling what looked like modular floats and construction equipment. I drove up the ridge in my truck only to find the HOA president herself, Karen Whitfield, a woman whose name I'd only seen on mailers before directing traffic like she was queen of the subdivision. She wore white capris, a Ridgepoint Meadows windbreaker, and mirrored sunglasses, even though the sun hadn't cleared the tree line. Karen, I called, stepping out. What the hell is going on? She turned, visibly annoyed. We're installing Ridgepoint Meadows' new floating cafe, she said, as if I were a bystander and not the person whose lake they were about to violate. It's a community initiative to increase resident engagement and add value to our lakeside amenities. I blinked. Your lakeside amenities? You've had exclusive use of this body of water for years, she said, cool and clipped. But our community plans were approved by the HOA board and pre-registered with the city's Parks and Rec. It's time the lake served everyone, not just a recluse. It was so absurd I couldn't speak. I opened my folder again, showing the documents. She waved it away. Our legal team has reviewed everything. If you'd like to file a formal objection, you're welcome to present it at the next HOA meeting. And that's how it began. That day, they began lowering anchors into the water. A team of divers dropped down and installed platform supports. Flotation panels' bright blue plastic monstrosities began dotting the calm surface like a virus. I watched in disbelief as construction equipment arrived by barge, carrying prefab structures meant to become the new Ridgepoint Meadows floating cafe and bistro. Every nail they drove into a beam felt like a violation. But what hurt more than the noise, more than the construction, was the silence from the city. When I filed complaints with zoning and planning, they said the HOA had a conditional use permit pending review. When I called Parks and Wildlife, they said the lake wasn't officially classified as a protected habitat. It's privately owned, I reminded them, but it appears to serve as a common area under the revised boundary maps submitted by the HOA, the city official said over the phone. Do you have documentation to the contrary? I have 30 years of documentation, I snapped. Then you might need legal counsel. I hung up. That night, I sat on my dock feet, dangling just above the water. The frogs were quiet. The usual ripple of nightbirds, egrets, loons, mallards was missing. The construction floodlights reflected off the lake like a surgical lamp, sterilely and wrong. I looked down at the water so still it looked like glass. Somewhere below was a man-made release system built in the 70s before zoning laws changed. I hadn't touched it in years, but I remembered every inch of its blueprint, every lever, every gate valve. Julie had once joked, "You love that lake more than you love people." That night, I wasn't so sure she was wrong. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift in me. Something dark, something old, something like resolve. It didn't take long for their so-called vision to metastasize into something grotesque. Within a week, the lake I had once called sacred looked like a construction site floating atop a body on life support. They called it progress. I called it desecration. Karen and her inner circle of board members held a public launch the following Saturday. Loudspeakers boomed across the water announcing the groundbreaking of a new chapter in Ridgepoint Meadows community living. There were food trucks, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, drone cameras buzzing overhead. I watched from my dock as the HOA broadcast it all live on their Facebook page, using my lake as their trophy, like I didn't exist. They hadn't just claimed the water, they had rebranded it. A glossy new banner stretched across the floating scaffolding, "Coming soon, Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Cafe and Bistro, where community meets the calm." They even changed the name of the lake on the HOA website to Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. Just like that. As if years of legal ownership, conservation, and sweat equity could be erased with a WordPress login. I tried to stay calm. I tried to handle it the right way. I wrote letters. I compiled my original deed water rights certificate historic plats and a county memo from 2009 explicitly stating the HOA boundaries did not include the lake bed. I mailed copies to the HOA board, to City Hall, to the Department of Natural Resources. I even left printed packets at the HOA clubhouse and slipped one under Karen's windshield wiper. No one responded. Instead, the HOA doubled down. They sent out a beautifully typeset community vision statement in every mailbox. It read like it was written by a marketing firm trying to sell utopia. The Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Cafe and Bistro will serve as a year-round gathering point for families, seniors, and guests, offering farm-to-table cuisine, kayak rentals, and weekly lakeside concerts. A celebration of togetherness, reflection, and local pride on the serene waters we share. We share, they said. There was no mention of me. No mention that the serene waters they praised were the property of a man still breathing, still fighting. They began hiring contractors from out of state likely to avoid gossip. The lake surface was carved up with buoys and floating partitions. A steel frame kitchen shell was lowered onto pontoons while welders in goggles worked through the night. The sounds echoed through the valley like hammer blows against my spine. And through it all, the wildlife fled. The great blue heron who nested on the eastern bank vanished. The turtles who sunbathed on my floating log stopped coming. Algae began blooming thick near the construction zone, stirred by fuel leakage from the barge engines. I measured nitrate spikes from the runoff every morning. I photographed the changes, but every environmental complaint I filed came back the same permit under review. Monitoring ongoing. No confirmed violations. I wasn't just losing the lake. I was losing myself. One afternoon, I tried to reason with a younger board member, a guy named David Tran, who used to jog past my property in the mornings. He seemed like someone with a conscience, maybe even a little uncomfortable about the whole project. I caught him as he was locking up the floating site's temporary tool station on the lake edge. "David," I said, "do you understand what you're doing here? This isn't just some underused corner of Ridgepoint Meadows. This is my land. That water belongs to me." He glanced around, lowering his voice. "Tom, I get it. I really do. But Karen, she's convinced the community has a right to it. She keeps quoting some clause about undeveloped adjacent properties serving common good. That clause only applies to HOA-maintained easements," I snapped. This lake was never part of Ridgepoint Meadows' jurisdiction. You can't just build a floating restaurant on someone else's property and pretend it's for the public good. He looked down at his clipboard. "I'm just a board volunteer, man," he muttered. I don't make the decisions. No, I said, but you'll be part of the lawsuit if this keeps going. His eyes widened slightly. I wasn't bluffing. But I didn't file. Not yet. Legal fees would bleed me dry, and I'd seen how HOAs played the long game, dragging lawsuits through procedural mud until the opposition broke or bankrupted. Besides, I still hoped someone in the city would wake up. That hope died 2 days later when I received an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from the city's Planning and Development Office. I opened it slowly. This letter is to inform you that the Ridgepoint Meadows Homeowners Association has applied for retroactive integration of Lake Parcel 12C into the Ridgepoint Meadows Civic Usage Zone under Ordinance 47F. Retroactive integration. They were trying to change the map after they'd already started building. Buried in the fine print, the notice gave me 10 business days to file a formal objection. After that, the plat map would be amended, and my lake would be zoned as a civic utility resource. I sat down hard on the edge of my truck bed, my hands trembling. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was a surgical campaign to erase my claim before anyone could stop it. They were doing this legally, or at least they wanted it to look legal. I stared out at the lake that night, its once still surface now broken by metal lights and noise. In the center, the skeletal frame of the floating cafe rose like a mockery of everything Julie and I had tried to protect. The dock where we used to watch fireflies was now chained off with a caution construction area sign, zip-tied to my own damn railing. I stood there for a long time, the paperwork clutched in my hand, before heading back inside. I didn't sleep. Instead, I unlocked the old metal cabinet in the garage. Inside was a blueprint tube I hadn't touched in 15 years. My fingers hesitated on the cap, because deep down I already knew what was inside. The morning I unrolled the blueprint on my kitchen table, everything changed. It was yellowed at the edges, creased and fragile from age, but the ink was still sharp. I traced the contours with my finger, remembering every line, every measurement. My father had drawn it in 1972, back when this land was still unincorporated, and the lake barely more than a spring-fed basin carved out by glacial runoff. He'd designed the dock, the culverts, the overflow catchments, and most importantly, the emergency release valve, a deep, narrow channel with a hand-crank gate buried beneath a stone well at the edge of the east bank. That system had never been used, not once, but it was still there. I'd maintained it over the years, kept it oiled, cleaned, and secure because my father believed in resilience, and I believed in him. It was designed to drain the lake in 24 hours. And in that moment, looking down at the plans that had outlived him, I realized what I'd been trying to deny. No amount of polite letters or printed packets would stop them. They weren't just building without my consent. They were erasing me, erasing everything this lake stood for. And I couldn't let that happen. The very next day, construction intensified. The steel frame of the restaurant went up shockingly fast. Cranes hoisted the walls into place from the shoreline, while a flotilla of barges secured the flotation base with heavy chains. The structure looked like something from a resort catalog: sleek glass walls, solar-paneled roofing, even LED-lit railings that changed color at night. And right in the center, a banner in cursive gold, "Opening soon." Neighbors flocked to the shoreline to watch like it was a fireworks show. Kids rode their bikes to the edge of my property, pressing their faces to the fence line. HOA volunteers passed out flyers about the restaurant's grand opening weekend, listing menu samples, live music, and, ironically, environmentally sourced fish from Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. My fish. That same afternoon, Karen herself marched right up to my fence with a clipboard. I watched her from the porch, coffee in hand. "Tom," she called brightly, "just wanted to drop off the community guidelines for the launch event." I didn't answer. She hesitated, then stepped closer to the gate. "You'll be pleased to know we've taken safety precautions to prevent runoff contamination. The structure is completely self-contained. All waste will be hauled off-site." "How thoughtful," I said, not moving. She smiled as if I'd complimented her personally. "We're even coordinating with the city for optional kayak tours around the lake. Families are going to love it. It's not your lake." Her smile faltered for the briefest second, then returned. "It is now," she said, soft and smug. "Tom." I almost said it right then. "I hope you know how to swim." But I bit my tongue. Instead, I let her drop the clipboard at my gate and walk away, heels crunching on gravel, like a victory parade. Over the next few days, I watched them install floating walkways, secure pontoons, and finalize interior fittings. Contractors drilled into anchored steel while laughing over boxed lunches. A hired chef in a Ridgepoint Meadows polo did a live stream kitchen sneak peek while standing on what used to be a lily pad bed. Inside, I began preparing. I copied every blueprint page, scanned every permit denial, and even drafted a timeline of the construction in case it ever went to court. Not that I expected justice in court. I knew how deep HOA pockets ran. But I needed to keep my mind clear, my actions precise. That meant I needed to get into the valve housing. On the third night, after Karen's visit, I slipped on my waders, grabbed my flashlight, and walked through the tree line to the eastern edge of the lake. Moonlight shimmered on the water, still and silent, except for the occasional creak of the floating structure far across the lake. I stepped carefully through the underbrush until I reached the old stone well. It was hidden behind dense bramble, the kind of spot no one would notice unless they were looking for it. I brushed back the branches and knelt beside the circular hatch. A ring of rust clung to the edge, but the bolts were still firm. I used my father's old wrench to loosen the cap, then lifted it slowly. The interior smelled of damp iron and moss. I shone my flashlight down. There it was. The manual crank, the gear teeth, the sluice gate lever. Intact, waiting. I closed it gently and covered it again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the moment the cafe would open. The smug speeches, the drone footage, the toasts made on my lake with wine and ignorance. They had made a theater of my grief. I remembered building the dock with Julie, her hands covered in paint, the way she laughed when the canoe tipped and we both fell in. The floating lanterns we used to send off on our anniversary one for every year we made it. I remembered the silence after the diagnosis, and the way the lake stayed still for days after she was gone, like it knew. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about memory, about love, about the right to mourn in peace. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA's law firm. Dear Mr. Keller, it has come to our attention that you have repeatedly trespassed upon Ridgepoint Meadows community development grounds and have engaged in verbal harassment of contractors on site. Please be advised that further incidents may result in legal action and a restraining order. Additionally, any interference with HOA-sanctioned property may be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. It was absurd. They had built on my lake, and now they were threatening to ban me from it. That evening, I sat on the dock and watched the restaurant's lights flicker across the surface. The water was still, but I could feel a pulse beneath it, a pressure building. They had no idea what lay beneath their floating dream. No idea what my father had built. No idea what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. The water started changing before the people did. By the second week of construction, the lake had gone from a crisp, reflective mirror to a murky shade of green. You didn't need a lab to tell you it was sick. A slick of film floated along the restaurant's perimeter, oily rainbow-hued in the sunlight. The ducks that once nested near the cattails abandoned the shoreline altogether. I watched one limp away with a piece of plastic netting tangled around its leg. The HOA posted photos on their Facebook page anyway. Sunset at Ridgepoint Meadows Lake, floating cafe nearing completion, opening soon. Our residents deserve this beauty. I commented on one post. This lake is privately owned. Construction runoff is killing the fish. Water rights are being violated. This isn't beauty, it's theft. 10 minutes later, my comment was deleted. 10 minutes after that, I was blocked from the page. I took water samples every morning and mailed them to an independent lab in Denver. I documented fuel leakage, pH fluctuations, and trace levels of nitrates and detergents. Each day, I photographed the algae blooms growing thicker around the construction site. Still, the city remained in review of the HOA's application for retroactive zoning inclusion. And then came the fish. Hundreds of them, bluegill, perch, even the koi I'd released years ago, all dead. Floating bellies up along the eastern shore. Their eyes clouded, their scales flaking from their bodies. I stood over them with a knot in my gut, remembering how Julie used to feed them breadcrumbs while dipping her toes into the water. I called environmental services. A young man named Carter answered. He sounded bored. Sir, we have your previous complaints on file. Unfortunately, as the HOA's construction has not been legally classified as invasive or in violation of code, There's not much we can do until the final inspection. They're killing everything in that lake. I understand your frustration. No, you don't. This isn't a development. This is ecosystem collapse. This is my wife's ashes scattered beneath that surface. This is the last thing I have left that's still alive. And they're killing it for brunch service. There was silence on the line. Finally, he said, I'll escalate your report. But legally, we need more than anecdotal evidence. I hung up. And then the real manipulation began. I started hearing whispers at the gas station, the hardware store, even church. Things like Tom's being difficult again. Or he always thought the lake was his, but I heard the Platt say otherwise. The Ridgepoint Meadows newsletter ran a resident spotlight featuring Karen. In it, she spoke glowingly about transforming underutilized land into something inspiring. She claimed the restaurant would bring the community together and honor the natural beauty of our shared resources. I recognized one of the photos in the article. It was taken from my dock, the dock I built with my own hands, now rebranded as a community lakefront experience. The final slap came in the form of a flyer stapled to every tree and utility pole along the neighborhood road. Stop the negativity. Support progress. One man's bitterness shouldn't rob Ridgepoint Meadows of joy. The lake is ours now. Let's move forward together. No names, no author. But everyone knew who they were talking about. David Trans stopped jogging past my house. His wave turned into a glance away. Even the mailman, a guy named Rudy, who used to chat with me about fishing, started dropping my letters in silence. I had become the villain. A bitter, lonely man clinging to a lake no one believed was his anymore. And the worst part, they wanted me to snap, Karen especially. She was waiting for it. She wanted me to vandalize something, to scream in a meeting, to file a lawsuit I couldn't afford, and then lose in public. That's how the HOA won. They made you look unreasonable. Then they painted your resistance as the real problem. But I didn't snap. I planned. Late one night, I sat at my workbench with my father's blueprints. I reviewed the old drainage system, 2 inlet chambers, a gravel filtration pocket, and a primary release gate 30 feet below the east shoreline. There were only 2 ways to open it. One involved a hydraulic pump, long since corroded. The other was a manual crank system hidden beneath the well I'd uncovered days before. I oiled the threads, repaired the tension lever, replaced a missing cog with a part I machined myself in the garage. When I finished, I sealed it all back up, just in case. 2 days later, Karen organized a community appreciation day at the lake. It was essentially a soft launch. A ribbon cutting, some music, a catered lunch spread on floating tables tethered to the shore. They even had a local news station there filming smiling residents as they walked the floating boardwalk. I watched from the tree line. Karen wore a blue pantsuit and pearls, giving interviews like a senator. She waved toward the bistro shell behind her, its shiny windows catching the sunlight like a promise. This project represents what's possible when neighbors come together, she said into the microphone. This lake is no longer a forgotten corner of the county. It's a symbol of unity. Unity. That word echoed in my head as I returned home that night. I stood at the water's edge, watching the glow of the cafe's floodlights spread across the now brown surface. The lake stank of rot and chemicals. Somewhere out in the middle, a heron drifted alone, feathers matted, looking lost. I reached down, picked up a stone, and skipped it across the surface. It vanished without a sound. Everything about the lake felt wrong now. Still, tense, like it was holding its breath, waiting. So was I. I wasn't ready yet, but I would be, because I wasn't going to lose this place. Not to lies, not to power, not to an HOA that thought its rules were above nature and ownership and grief. I was going to remind them what this lake really was, and what happened when you tried to build over something that refused to be claimed. It began with a letter slid under my front door like a snake. A single sheet of paper on Ridgepoint Meadows letterhead. This is your final warning. Continued interference with the Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Cafe project will constitute criminal trespass and harassment of contractors. You are hereby instructed to remain at least 200 feet from all construction areas on Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. Failure to comply may result in a restraining order and prosecution. It wasn't signed. No one took credit. But the envelope smelled faintly of Karen's perfume, the same cloying gardenia she wore at every event. I called the law office, printed at the bottom. The receptionist put me on hold, then came back with a voice that might as well have been reading from a script. "Mr. Keller, our client has a valid conditional use permit. Please direct any further communication to the city attorney's office." And she hung up. 2 days later, an anonymous email arrived from a Gmail address. "Think carefully about your next moves. Accidents happen around construction sites." I stared at the screen until the cursor blinked off. My palms were slick. They weren't just ignoring me now, they were trying to intimidate me. The smear campaign was just as calculated. Next week's Ridgepoint Meadows newsletter ran a front-page article titled "Protecting Our Community's Future from Misguided Anger." It never mentioned me by name, but it didn't have to. It described a local resident who was hoarding resources meant for everyone and spreading misinformation about environmental damage. Neighbors I'd known for years crossed the street rather than meet my eyes. Mrs. Levins, who used to bring me zucchini bread every summer, now stared at her shoes when I waved. Even David Tran avoided me. He sent a single text, "Sorry, man, they're twisting everything," and then went silent. I could feel them circling me, tightening the narrative. It was like a slow-motion mob, each person convinced they were on the right side, because they'd been fed just enough self-righteous language to keep them warm. One evening, as I was hauling my canoe up the bank, a group of teenagers on the new floating boardwalk started yelling. "Hey, Lake Grinch," one called. "Go back inside, old man," another shouted. Their laughter echoed across the water. I clenched my jaw and kept walking. My hands trembled not with fear, but with a deep, molten anger that was starting to feel dangerous. I forced myself to set the canoe down gently instead of hurling it. Karen appeared the next day with a smile sweet enough to rot teeth. "Tom," she said, "we've received multiple complaints about your behavior. People say you're yelling at children, threatening contractors. We have to take this seriously." I haven't yelled at anyone. She tilted her head like a kindergarten teacher. "Perception matters. You're creating a hostile environment. It would be best for everyone if you simply stayed off the lake until the grand opening." I laughed. I couldn't help it. My lake. She blinked. "Excuse me? This is my property, Karen. You're trespassing. You're the hostile environment." Her smile didn't slip. "The courts will decide that. Until then, let's all be good neighbors, shall we?" She patted the fence post like it was a dog and walked away. That night, I pored over my evidence: emails, letters, water samples, photographs. I printed copies, bound them in folders, and mailed them to the city attorney, the county's environmental enforcement office, even the local paper. I knew most of it would be ignored, but I had to leave a trail. The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Not damaged, gone. The wooden post uprooted, the metal box missing entirely. A single note left in its place: "You're making things harder for yourself." I drove to the HOA clubhouse, the folder of blueprints on the seat beside me. The parking lot was full, some kind of special board meeting. I walked inside past startled volunteers into the main hall where Karen sat at the head of a long table. She didn't look surprised. "Mr. Keller," she said evenly, "this is a closed session. You've trespassed, polluted my lake, and stolen my property," I said, dropping the blueprints onto the table. "You're in violation of county water rights, environmental statutes, and at least 4 sections of the Ridgepoint Meadows Charter, and you know it." She folded her hands. "Do you have a court order to present?" "No. But I have 30 years of documentation, and I have the original engineering plans. This project is unsafe." A murmur went through the board members. Karen smiled thinly. "Then perhaps you should show them to the city. I'm sure they'll appreciate your input once the cafe is complete." Her confidence was like a slap. She knew exactly how long the city took to act. By the time my evidence reached anyone with authority, the cafe would be open, the narrative set, and the lake effectively gone. I left without another word. On the drive home, I kept seeing Julie's face, the way she'd smile at me when I got too riled up about something, the way she'd place her hand over mine and say, "Breathe. Think." I parked the truck in the garage and sat there with the engine off, staring at the blueprint tube on the passenger seat. Breathe. Think. They wanted me to crack, to make a mistake, to lash out so they could paint me as a criminal. Instead, I was going to do something else. I was going to do what my father had designed that lake for. I was going to do it clean. I was going to do it quietly. And I was going to do it at night. The night I made my decision, the lake was utterly still, no breeze, no moonlight. Just the low hum of the construction generators droning across the water like some mechanical heartbeat. It felt as if the whole place were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. I laid the blueprint out on the workbench for the last time. The paper had softened from years of handling, its edges curled, but the details were all still there: inlet gate coordinates, drain pipe diameters, the angular rotation of the crank arm, and the sequence of operations. My father had scrawled notes in the margins, in neat all-capital letters. Warnings about water pressure, guidance on sediment flow, redundant fail-safes in case of winter blockage. He had built the drainage system to withstand disasters, and it had. Droughts, heavy rains, flash floods, nothing had ever overwhelmed it. But no one ever expected the disaster would come from above. I rolled the blueprint, gently slid it into its tube, and tucked it behind a stack of lumber in the corner. Then I packed a duffel bag with the tools I'd need: flashlight socket wrenches, valve grease, an old canvas harness, gloves, and 2 rusted but functional diving weights to anchor myself while climbing into the well shaft. I moved like someone sleepwalking. Not out of fear, but focus. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I wasn't destroying property. I was activating a safeguard built long before HOA lines or Karen's condo dreams existed. I was doing exactly what the system was designed to do: manage overflow, protect the terrain, and return the lake to equilibrium. It just so happened that their restaurant didn't float in equilibrium. It floated in illusion, and illusions don't survive exposure. At 2:47 a.m., I stepped into the water. I had mapped the most efficient route across the shallows to the eastern inlet, well where the release shaft sat sealed beneath the brambles. The frogs were gone. No herons, no bats. Just me, the lake, and the quiet creak of the distant floating boardwalk. I knelt at the edge of the well, my breath fogged in the cool air. I paused because I needed to. I thought of Julie, her soft voice, her stubborn hope. I wasn't sure if she'd be proud of this moment or horrified. Maybe both. But one thing I knew for certain: she wouldn't want me to let them take everything. So I lifted the hatch. It creaked open like a coffin lid. Cold air rose from below, smelling of stone and rust. I slipped the harness over my shoulders, cinched the weights to my belt, and lowered myself down into the darkness. The descent was slower than I remembered. My boots pressed against the damp inner walls, and the rope burned against my gloves with every inch. When my feet hit the base, I stood waist-deep in icy water. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, catching the familiar silhouette of the crank housing. Still there, still waiting. The valve was protected by a steel cage. I unlocked the cover plate with 2 heavy turns of the wrench. Then I took the crank handle and began to rotate slow, deliberate turns clockwise, just as the blueprint instructed. The system groaned. A low thunk echoed through the stone chamber, followed by the rush of moving water far below. I kept turning. The pressure differential kicked in faster than I expected. Sediment flushed. The old sluice gates opened in stages, feeding the lower runoff channel that ran beneath the ridge and emptied half a mile downstream into an abandoned ravine. I checked the flow gauges, mechanical dials my father had installed in the 70s. They ticked up steadily. Within 6 hours, the water would begin dropping. Within 10, the floating restaurant would lose balance. By dawn, it would sink. I didn't smile. This wasn't revenge, it was release. I climbed out of the well, covered the hatch, and cleaned my footprints from the nearby mud. No signs. No tools left behind. No fingerprints. Just the lake. Still calm. Still glowing with the faint reflection of a half-built dream. By the time I returned home, my clothes soaked and my body trembling, the clock read 4:13 a.m. I made tea. Then I waited. At first, nothing changed. The restaurant lights still blinked like fireflies. The boardwalk gently rocked. But by 5:30, I noticed the shift in reflection lines. The water line had lowered by less than a foot, but it was enough. The cafe's platform didn't adjust. They hadn't built it with drop tolerance. It had been engineered for an aesthetic float stable as long as the water remained consistent. But my father's system didn't care about aesthetics. It responded to pressure, gravity, and time. By 6:15, the metal anchor cables groaned audibly across the lake. One of the floating walkways tipped at an angle, sloshing water onto its deck. 2 of the LED lights along the restaurant's edge shorted out in a hiss of sparks. The lake continued its slow, inevitable descent, calm, clean, and deliberate. At 6:42 a.m., I heard the first scream. A contractor probably arriving early for final inspections. I stood at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in my flannel jacket, tea in hand, and watched the chaos begin. He ran across the gravel path, shouting into his phone. The restaurant tilted visibly now, one side nearly submerged, the other lifted like a sinking ship. More workers arrived, then Karen. She came barreling down the HOA access road in her white Lexus SUV, hair unbrushed, clutching a coffee she never sipped. Her mouth opened wide as she took in the scene. The platform lurching sideways, furniture inside, rolling banners tearing from their mounts. She screamed something pointed frantically at the water, and then stumbled back as the central float beneath the kitchen chamber gave way. A rush of water splashed upward as the structure cracked at its midpoint and slowly folded in on itself, pulling the decking into a twisted arch. The whole thing groaned like a dying whale, and then collapsed. One massive splash, then silence. Water surged across the lake surface in low waves, lapping gently at the untouched side of the shore. Steam rose from electrical short circuits. A curtain of silence followed. No applause, no sirens, no noise. Just Karen standing ankle-deep in mud mascara, bleeding down her cheeks. She looked across the water, directly at me. Our eyes met, and for the first time since this war began, she looked scared. The official incident report would later call it an unexpected structural failure due to unstable flotation infrastructure exacerbated by rapid changes in water level. But I knew better, and so did Karen. By 7:00 a.m., the entire floating restaurant had collapsed into a crooked mess of warped metal and waterlogged beams. Half of it sat submerged at a 45-degree angle. The main dining platform had split down the center, the overhead awning now drooping like a broken wing. From the tree line, I could see the tips of chairs and shattered light fixtures bobbing like wreckage after a storm. The water level had dropped just under 4 feet, enough to tip everything, enough to expose the truth they'd built on instability, on assumption, on a lake they didn't own. And when the foundation receded, when the quiet natural force beneath them shifted, they were powerless. Karen's screams echoed across the banks, raw and uncontrolled. I don't think I've ever seen her unravel like that. Her windbreaker was soaked from the knees down, and her platinum hair, usually sprayed into place like armor, clung wet to her forehead. She paced in circles, waving her phone in the air, barking orders at no one who listened. I kept my distance. By 7:15, Ridge Point Meadows residents began arriving. They came in robes, workout clothes, coffee cups in hand, drawn by the sirens that hadn't yet arrived, and the panic rising on the HOA group chat. I could hear their murmurs as they gathered near the dock and stared out at the floating disaster. What happened? Was there a storm last night? Is it sinking? No one even told us it was open yet. Someone filmed the scene with their phone. Another person live-streamed it to the HOA Facebook page, voice trembling as they narrated Karen's meltdown beside the smoking ruin. A child asked if the lake was broken. His mother pulled him away. I stood in the shadows of the tree line, arms folded, unreadable. Then the emergency vehicles began to arrive. First a local fire unit, red lights flashing but no siren. Then a municipal code enforcement SUV. Then finally, a black city environmental protection van, a department I knew well from my years responding to flood infrastructure emergencies. Out stepped Laura Steele. I hadn't seen her in nearly 12 years. She wore a navy utility vest over a crisp shirt, hair pulled into a high ponytail, clipboard already in hand. She looked older, sharper, but just as no-nonsense as the last time I saw her surveying a collapsed culvert outside Durango. When our eyes met, her brow furrowed slightly, recognition, surprise, and something like understanding flashing all at once. She walked straight to the shoreline. Karen tried to intercept her. "There's been sabotage," Karen said breathlessly, waving her hands. "We believe someone, a resident, may have tampered with the water levels. This whole project is under threat, and we need to secure the area immediately. I want this entire lake cordoned off and a full investigation into—" "Ma'am," Laura cut her off calmly. "Do you have a completed permit for this structure?" Karen blinked. "We have a conditional permit. It's been pending final review," meaning construction wasn't approved yet. Well, technically, it was pre-approved for inspection. Was a safety impact report filed? Karen hesitated. Laura turned and looked out at the floating ruin. "I'm going to need to see all zoning documents, contractor files, and environmental impact assessments by end of day," she said flatly. "And no one touches that water until my team finishes sampling." Karen turned red. "But this is Ridge Point Meadows Lake. We have civic use rights under pending reclassification." Laura didn't even blink. According to the city plat, this lake is privately owned. That sentence rippled through the crowd like a dropped stone. Several residents turned to each other confused. I thought it was community property. Didn't we get a letter about it being shared? Karen stiffened. We were under the impression. No, Laura, said her voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. This land and this body of water are legally designated as Parcel 12C. It has never been incorporated into Ridgepoint Meadows' HOA boundary. I remember signing off on the original conservation designation myself back in '09. More murmurs. Karen's mouth opened. No words came out. Laura's team moved quickly. 2 technicians donned waders and moved into the water with sampling kits. One of them flagged a slick near the sunken kitchen float. Another marked algae patches with orange tape. A drone operator launched a small unit overhead to capture the full damage. I could have stepped forward then, made a scene, told everyone I'd drained the lake, that I had every right, that I'd warned them, that no one listened, but I didn't, because I didn't need to. The lake had already spoken for me. And when nature speaks, it doesn't shout. It pulls. It tilts. It reclaims. By mid-morning, Karen was seated in the back of the fire unit wrapped in a blanket and speaking in frantic half-sentences to someone on speakerphone. 2 board members argued on the sidewalk over whose responsibility the structural inspections were. David Tran stood near the road with his hands on his head, looking like someone who just realized he'd joined the wrong team. Laura found me an hour later sitting on the tailgate of my truck under a pine tree. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a bottle of water and sat beside me. I figured you'd still be alive, she said finally. But I didn't expect to find you in the middle of a scandal. I gave her a tired smile. It wasn't my scandal. She nodded slowly. But it was your lake. We sat there in silence, watching the city truck tow away the floating wreckage piece by soggy piece. Every chunk of plastic and metal hauled out was a weight lifted off the water. The more they took, the clearer the lake seemed to become, like it was healing in real time. Laura looked at me. Did you open the valve? I didn't answer. She didn't press. Instead, she sighed. I'll file a preliminary injunction. That should halt any future zoning claims. But Tom, you might still get pulled into this legally. I know. Was it worth it? I thought of Julie, the birds, the dock, the silence of the water. Yes, I said. By noon, the media had arrived. First, it was a local news van with a peeling logo and a guy who looked too young to drive holding a boom mic. Then came the regional affiliate, a blonde anchor in heels stepping around mud puddles in search of a dramatic backdrop. And finally, a news helicopter circled overhead, its blades thwacking the air as if beating a war drum. The HOA had wanted publicity. Now they had it. But this wasn't ribbon-cutting day anymore. This was disaster coverage, complete with B-roll of sunken pontoons, drone footage of algae scum, and wide shots of confused pajama-clad residents asking what exactly they'd funded with their HOA dues. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she'd left in the back of a city enforcement SUV, not under arrest, but definitely not in charge anymore. The HOA board had gone silent. Their website displayed only a placeholder page under maintenance. Thank you for your patience. Their Facebook group, once a hotbed of performative positivity and neighborhood gossip, was locked to new posts. Screenshots, however, spread like wildfire. One post in particular went viral. HOA sinks $2 million restaurant into private lake, blames the lake. The comments underneath were brutal. Some were angry, some were hilarious. All were damning. I wasn't named in the piece. But the article quoted a longtime landowner who had filed complaints for months and was allegedly in possession of historic environmental blueprints contradicting HOA claims. The phrasing was delicate, but everyone in Ridgepoint Meadows knew exactly who it meant. Suddenly, I wasn't the villain anymore. I was a mystery, a ghost with a deed and a valve. I tried not to let it change me, but I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me, a small, bruised, tired part that felt vindicated as hell, watching Karen's floating dream rot beneath the waterline. Still, I wasn't free yet. That afternoon, I received a call from the city attorney's office. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Marla Epstein's civil litigation liaison. Mr. Keller, she said, I've reviewed the documents you sent, including the original water rights deed, the plat maps, and the scanned blueprints. I'd like to confirm, are you asserting that the HOA proceeded with construction on your property without express consent? Yes, I said simply. And are you prepared to provide sworn testimony to that effect? I am. She paused. We've also received a letter from the Ridgepoint Meadows legal team alleging that you caused malicious damage to the structure by manipulating the lake level. They can allege what they like. They're pushing for criminal negligence. I felt my pulse rise. I didn't break anything. I didn't touch their platform. All I did was open a floodgate designed for water control. A system installed before Ridgepoint Meadows was even drawn on a napkin. Another pause. Is that true? I have the maintenance logs to prove it, the flow rate, the sediment data. The city approved that system in 1975. She took a breath. I could hear her typing. I'll schedule a deposition. In the meantime, do not communicate with any HOA members directly. If anyone attempts to contact or intimidate you, report it to my office. Already had one mailbox disappear. I'll include that in the record. We hung up. The legal war had officially begun. I wasn't worried about winning. Not really. I had truth on my side. Evidence. Time. But I was worried about how far they'd go to spin their narrative. And sure enough, the next morning, an editorial appeared in the county paper. When one man blocks progress, the dark side of NIMBYism. In every neighborhood, there's someone who clings to the past so tightly, they're willing to drown the future. We must ask ourselves, at what point does personal ownership become community obstruction? It wasn't signed, but the voice was familiar. I knew it was Karen. This was her last shot to frame herself as a visionary crushed by old grudges. To paint me as a bitter relic hoarding beauty while the world moved forward. It would have worked too, if not for the next report. That afternoon, Laura returned with her environmental team. She had a clipboard in one hand, a sealed bag in the other. We tested the water, she said. 3 separate sites. Your runoff complaints were valid. Fuel leaks from the construction barges. High concentrations of detergent and chemical stabilizers. One sample even had elevated E. coli, likely from improperly stored waste. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. They didn't just violate zoning, she continued. They violated 3 city health codes and 2 environmental protection ordinances. She handed me a copy of the report. And this, she added, holding out the bag, was found embedded in the mud near the cafe's eastern float. It's a broken mooring cable. Inside the bag was a frayed piece of steel line black with oil. They claimed sabotage. Said you tampered with their anchors, but this cable snapped from stress, not cutting. Your valve did lower the water, but the failure, that was their own engineering. I felt something deep in my chest finally loosen. Not joy, not even relief. Just breath. Real breath. Like I'd been underwater this whole time and didn't know it. I sat on the dock that evening, legs swinging over the edge like I used to do with Julie. The lake had calmed again. The water line was lower but clearer. The algae was receding. A single egret landed on the far side near the cattails and stood perfectly still as if giving me permission to exhale. A soft knock broke the quiet. It was David Tran. He stood awkwardly at the end of my driveway holding 2 beers. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I didn't move. But I think you were right. From the start. And I'm sorry I didn't say anything sooner. I gestured to the bench beside the dock. He walked over and sat down. We drank in silence. For the first time in months, it wasn't heavy. The lake reflected stars again. And the lies, the ones that had been built on paper and pride and politeness, had finally sunk. The lawsuit came 2 weeks later. Courier dropped it off mid-morning manila envelope heavy with accusations, titles stacked like ammunition, property, interference, reckless negligence, willful endangerment, environmental sabotage. The plaintiff, Ridgepoint Meadows Homeowners Association. The defendant, me. I wasn't surprised. I'd been waiting. Inside was a 67-page complaint, dense with legalese photographs of the collapsed floating restaurant, a list of damages exceeding $2.3 million, and accusations that I had deliberately altered water flow in order to sabotage a civic structure intended for community benefit. They even claimed emotional distress on behalf of Karen Whitfield, who, according to the filing, had suffered irreparable reputational harm as a direct result of Mr. Keller's conduct. That line almost made me laugh. Almost. I sat in my kitchen and read it from cover to cover. Then I placed it neatly back into the envelope, poured myself a cup of coffee, and dialed the number I'd been saving for over a decade. Dana Landon. We'd worked together once years ago on an environmental remediation site outside of Denver. She'd been a city attorney back then. Smart, surgical with the law, and not afraid to get her boots muddy. Last I heard, she'd gone into private practice specializing in land use and water rights. When she answered, her voice hadn't changed. "Keller," she said almost incredulously, "you still alive?" "Barely. You still taking clients?" "I'm guessing this isn't about a parking ticket." "HOA built a floating restaurant on my lake." Pause. "On your lake?" "They said it was theirs." I opened an old drainage valve. The restaurant sank. "Now they're suing me for $2 million. Another pause, then a low, impressed whistle. "I'm listening." Within 48 hours, Dana drove up from Boulder with a briefcase full of statutory printouts and a kind of ferocious clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. She stayed in town for 3 days. We walked the shoreline. She reviewed every document I had. Property deeds, zoning maps, environmental certificates, the blueprints from my father, the flow data, even the water quality reports from Laura's team. Her eyes lit up when she saw the nitrate levels. This alone could get them federally fined. She filed a countersuit the following Monday. Trespassing, environmental degradation, property theft, defamation, harassment. Within the week, the local newspaper published a new headline: HOA faces countersuit in lake collapse scandal. The mood in Ridgepoint Meadows shifted almost overnight. People who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly waved from their driveways. One neighbor left a handwritten note in my mailbox. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Thank you for protecting the lake." And then the real unraveling began. Karen was forced to step down from her position on the board. It wasn't made public at first, but word leaked that the city had issued a cease and desist on any future HOA-led development until the investigation was complete. Several contractors filed claims of unpaid invoices. The Ridgepoint Meadows HOA bank account was frozen pending litigation. Dana worked like fire. Every day she emailed me updates with subject lines like "another nail in the coffin" or "city filing confirms water rights in your favor." She even discovered that the HOA had never finalized the conditional permit they claimed to have. Their entire construction effort had been built on temporary approval that expired weeks before the platform went up. They knew it. They built anyway. And when it collapsed, literally, they tried to pin it on me. By late fall, Ridgepoint Meadows' legal team reached out quietly. They wanted to settle. Dana smiled when she read the email. Always a good sign when the bully starts whispering. The offer: they'd drop their lawsuit if I dropped mine. They'd issue a public apology, remove all HOA claims from the lake, and fund an ecological restoration project to undo the damage caused by the cafe. They even offered to pay my legal fees. I should have said yes. I didn't. Not yet. Because there was one condition: I needed something no legal brief could capture. I wanted the lake named officially, legally, publicly, on the record. Not Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. Not Community Waters. But Julie's Lake. Dana raised an eyebrow when I said it. "That's what you want." "That's all I want." She made it happen. Turns out, under Colorado waterway naming provisions, a landowner can petition for an official naming if the body of water resides entirely within their parcel and no prior designation exists. She filed the paperwork, collected signatures, submitted the environmental history, attached Julie's obituary. 2 months later, I received a letter from the state. In accordance with Land Use Code 7.2a, the lake, formerly known as Parcel 12C, has been officially recorded under the name Julie's Lake. I didn't cry when I opened it. I just folded it, placed it in the drawer beside her wedding ring, and walked down to the dock. The sun was rising over the ridge, and the lake, her lake, was still, quiet, alive. The floating restaurant was long gone, removed piece by piece down to the last bolt. The algae had cleared. The herons had returned. One of them glided low over the surface as I stepped onto the dock, like it was welcoming me home. Later that afternoon, I stood before a gathering of neighbors, some Ridgepoint Meadows, some from the wider county, as the city posted the final placard on the public trailhead. Julie's Lake, a protected private watershed. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need to. Karen was nowhere to be seen. The board had been restructured this time, with a new president who looked me in the eye and shook my hand. "It won't happen again," he said. "You have our word." I nodded, because now they knew, not just that the lake belonged to me, but that some things are more than property. Some things are legacy. Some things are sacred. And if they're worth building on, they're worth protecting. The following spring, the lake bloomed again. You wouldn't have known what happened if you didn't live through it. The surface sparkled like it always had, glassy and clean-kissed by morning mist and rimmed with wildflowers. The trees stood taller, greener, and the birds returned in full chorus. It felt like the land itself was exhaling finally after everything. And me. I was breathing too. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel tight in my chest. The anger that had coiled itself into the corners of my ribs began to ease. Not because the fight had been easy, it wasn't. Not because I won money or headlines, I didn't care for either. But because I had done something that mattered. Something Julie would have understood. Something bigger than pride. I'd protected what was hers, what was ours. I'd saved her lake. I remember standing on the dock that April morning, barefoot, coffee steaming in my hand, and watching a line of goslings wobble across the far bank. Their mother led them patiently one by one into the water. They floated like tiny lanterns, bright and blinking against the surface. Peace, I realize, doesn't come all at once. It arrives in fragments, small, quiet ones. A bird returning to its old nest. A breeze without tension. A neighbor waving and meaning it. Even the HOA changed. The new board president, Mark Delling, turned out to be more than just polite. He was a retired firefighter with a soft spot for ecology and a clear head when it came to paperwork. He met with me personally every month to review HOA boundaries and pledged full transparency. One day, he even helped me plant new willow saplings near the southern bank where the cafe once floated. "You were right," he said, patting the dirt down. "We forgot this place had a soul." It wasn't just talk. The HOA voted to fund a shoreline buffer project removing invasive plants and rebuilding native habitat. They created an environmental stewardship committee and, to my shock, invited me to chair it. At first, I declined. But eventually, I agreed on one condition: no meetings inside the HOA clubhouse. We'd meet at the lake, always. And so we did. Every first Saturday, we sat in a circle on folding chairs beneath the pines and talked like neighbors again, not adversaries. It took time. There were still sideways glances. A few residents who'd rather forget the whole thing ever happened. But most stayed. Most listened. Some even apologized. David Tran showed up to every meeting. Quiet, helpful, remorseful. One evening, after picking up trash near the dock, he lingered behind. "I read the court filings," he said. "All of it. I didn't know how deep they went." "They counted on you not knowing," I said. He nodded. "I want to be better than that." I believed him. Even Laura Gruff, City Code Laura, came by sometimes, more relaxed now. She brought her dog, let it splash in the shallows while we talked watershed restoration. Once she sat beside me at dusk and said, "You know, this place feels sacred. Not just protected, sacred." I smiled. "It is." We watched the sunset ripple across the water. For a long time, we didn't say anything. Then she asked, "Do you ever regret what you did?" I thought about that. About the nights I couldn't sleep, the smear campaigns, the mailbox that vanished, the courtrooms, the whispering neighbors. About Julie's face in my memory when I stood over that valve. About how close I'd come to walking away from it all. And I answered honestly. "No," I said. "But I do wish it hadn't come to that. Because I never wanted a war. I never wanted to destroy anything. I just wanted to be left alone with the memories I still had. But they wouldn't let me. So I reminded them that ownership doesn't begin and end with a plat map. That not everything can be measured in dollars or developments. That some things, some places hold weight that can't be seen until someone tries to steal it. I didn't drain the lake out of spite. I did it to reveal the truth. And in the process, I reclaimed more than just a body of water. I reclaimed myself. Now every morning, I walk the perimeter with my dog, Maggie. She's an old rescue hound with ears too big for her body and a bark too loud for the birds, but she loves the lake. She wades in like a child chasing shadows and leaves. Sometimes we sit on the dock together, and I talk to her like I used to talk to Julie. I tell her about the day the herons returned, about the frog songs that started again after the silt cleared, about the time a group of teenagers asked to help me replant native reeds. And once I told her the whole story start to finish, she didn't understand, of course, but she listened. And when I finished, she licked my hand, laid her head on my knee, and let out a sigh so deep it felt like it came from both of us. The lake shimmered behind her, still, silent, alive.